Hi everyone, we're here with Jenny Dowd. Jenny, give us a wave.
Hi.
Jenny works for Rae Environmental Inc. And also is involved in Western pollinators. So Jenny, we're here today kind of to talk about pollinator gardens and kind of how to get started and what to plant. So tell us a little bit. We've got a beautiful garden back behind you. We're a little early in the year, but what's happening behind you in your pollinator garden?
We are just starting to get up some of our early spring blooms and barely starting, but I've got a few poking up out of the ground. One of the main things that you want to focus on if you're looking to add some pollinator habitat to your existing garden landscape is to make sure that you have blooms that spread across the entire season, the entire active season, especially for bees and butterflies and any other pollinators that might visit your yard. So you really want to have them pretty much April through October is the target range, and about 2 to 3 different species of blooms during that time. So 2 for spring, 2 to 3 for summer, and 2 to 3 for fall time. Fall time blooms are especially important because pollinators utilize those resources for overwintering or to help fuel migrations that they might be doing during that time of the year. And so you mainly just want to make sure that you have a diversity of blooms across the season, and then you want to make sure that they have the ability to attract different types of pollinators to your garden space.
Perfect. So diversity is key. A lot of different things.
Diversity and incorporating natives too, because a lot of times those native pollinators have adapted alongside some of those native plants. So it's okay to have your favorite annuals and whatever else you want in the landscape, but try to incorporate a couple of native plants so that you have the adequate resources needed by those native pollinators that have co-adapted with them.
Perfect. So can you tell us, if you're like me and sometimes maybe don't have the best green thumb, do you have some plant recommendations that can get us started for
Absolutely.
kind of that spring, summer, fall?
I tell all my relatives not to buy me orchids because anything that needs attention I kill within a month. But a lot of the native plants luckily are very resilient, and a lot of them are perennials, so they'll come back year after year. If I was going to target 1 or 2 plants for each season, I would probably for the springtime target, let's see, I would probably go with some of the yarrow species. That's probably one of the best and easiest species to grow. They come back year after year, they thrive when you split them and add them to other spots in your yard, and they get utilized by multiple species, so they're really beneficial during the spring months. For summer, hands down, I would say milkweed. There's actually a professor through USU Extension in Tooele campus that is studying native bee use of milkweed plants, and he's found some pretty fascinating data. There's about 179 species documented so far that he's found that utilize the milkweed plants throughout the summer season. And he's not only finding that generalist bee species utilize those, but also some of his specialist species that focus on things like cactus are also utilizing those milkweed resources. So it's hands down in my yard one of the best pollinator species to get a diversity of bee use of all my plants that I use. I also really like the catmint. It gets a lot of action from a lot of different bee species. And then for summer, maybe one of the other ones are the sunflowers. Some of the Nuttall sunflowers are especially really attractive to those individuals. For winter species, I would probably go with something like goldenrod and aster. Those are kind of the most prolific ones that last a really long time through the winter season. They're some of the last blooms that you see. Also, the Rocky Mountain bee plant is a favorite of mine, and it gets hit pretty hard by especially bumblebee species in the area.
Great. So there's a lot to choose from that are pretty easy to care for, it sounds like.
There is, and a lot of those you can acquire through some of the local nurseries. So
great. So if you're just getting started, is it too late to start planting this spring?
It's not. A lot of species that are some of the native ones, you can plant in the fall and just by seed, and they'll pop up all on their own once they're ready to in the spring. But no, right now is the prime time to plant some of those. I would say to hold off on some of your mulching that people like to do early in the season, only because it can prevent some of those ground nesting bee species from emerging properly. So if you can wait till some of your other plants pop up, which is really when you want to wait for anyways, so that you know what you're mulching over, to apply the mulch, that would be best.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So we hit milkweed a little bit, but, and I had no idea milkweed was so beneficial to so many different kinds of insects. We always hear milkweed for monarchs. Is there other things we can help with monarchs as well besides milkweed?
So showy milkweed, Asclepias speciosa, is our most prolific native one, native milkweed species. Some of the other native plants that I already mentioned, like the Rocky Mountain bee plant, the sunflower, nettle sunflower, asters, goldenrod, all of those natives are going to be fantastic, not only for monarchs and not only for a lot of the native bee species, but for a lot of the other pollinators too, like your hummingbirds and some of your other bird species.
Perfect.
So yeah.
Yeah, and I'm thinking through this list, which they're really beautiful color-wise. You've got a variety of colors in these plants.
They are, lots of color variety. Bunch grasses too, I haven't mentioned those, but they've been shown to be really beneficial for a lot of the bee species. So if you want some contrast in your garden space, bunch grasses are a great way to go for that.
Okay. What about like ongoing maintenance once you've planted them and they're popping up?
Yeah.
I mean, how much water, fertilizer, pesticide, what do you do to care for yours?
So the great thing about these native species is most of them thrive in low water, low maintenance situations. So
Perfect.
it is, it's great to do a little bit. I know a lot of people have a hard time leaving things in the fall, but if you have a designated area in your yard where you can just leave some of the leaves and leave some of the spent blooms for overwintering, a lot of the ground nesters and queen bees, especially bumblebees, really thrive in those situations. So, I know a lot of people have a hard time leaving the leaves, but if you have one designated space that you can have some exposed ground and leave some of that leaf litter for overwintering populations, it's really beneficial. The milkweeds, their stems provide great cavities for some of the cavity nesters, which is a similar situation to the bee boxes. But if you can leave about 6 inches above, and then you really need to wait until you're hitting about 50 degrees during the daytime for about 7 consecutive days before you start cleaning that up. Otherwise, it's all for naught, and you're just going to be raking up all of your queen bees and chrysalises and whatnot. So.
Good tip to keep an eye on the weather. I love how you mentioned, though, for those of that are a little bit more OCD, and we want to rake everything up in the fall and make it pristine before the snow hits, that you can do that, but just keep a spot.
Yeah, find a corner of your yard that people don't see or that you don't constantly look at all winter long, or some of the behind the shed or something, and just leave a little area back there with some leaves on it and maybe some down twigs or logs, and make sure it doesn't get disturbed. Like rototillers are really bad for nesting bees. Lawnmowers and leaf blowers are hard on them. So if it can kind of be an off the beaten path area, that's best.
That's perfect. Less work for us. People don't see it. Nobody has to know it's there.
Gives you an excuse. It's for the bees.
It's for the bees. Perfect.
Yeah.
So obviously pesticides can be harmful. Tell us.
They can.
Can we avoid using them?
It's a touchy subject. Yes, if you can avoid pesticides, please do it. It's been one of the #1 detrimental things to really impact our pollinator population. And we need pollinators for our agricultural crops. So if you can avoid pesticides, it's best to try to just avoid them altogether. I know a lot of people hate creepy crawlies in their house. Mm-hmm. There's some things you can do as alternatives, like sticky traps behind dressers or behind bookcases. You can also try to do minimal spraying. A lot of people use companies. If you can get the companies to come during the evening hours when the pollinators are not out as much, and on no wind days when you're not going to be getting drift into some of your garden beds, those are the best tactics to use if you absolutely have to do it.
Perfect.
I know as well that sometimes people spray their fruit trees because of borers or other things. Again, if you can just do it in the evening hours when pollinators are not as active, and avoid windy days.
So you can kind of ease into this. If you're not ready to go like full bore, no spraying, just avoid those times when the pollinators are out and maybe slowly try and wean yourself off.
Exactly. And try to have sections of your yard, again, just like with the leaf litter. Try to have designated sections that you know are going to steer clear of some of those spray applications.
Perfect. So tell us a little bit. You mentioned ground dwellers, and I think some of us that love beautiful flowers, maybe we want to go overboard and like just cover everything with flowers.
Yes.
Do we need to be leaving some bare space?
You know, they don't need much bare space. Like I said before, some of those bunch grasses, they kind of mound up and they create some of that habitat. Most of what I've seen so far coming out this spring, I've seen a few queen bumblebees emerging already, and a lot of them are coming out of the center of some of those bunch grasses. So if you can leave a little bit of bare space somewhere that's not completely covered, that would be best. Also, I know a lot of people really like to have that finished look, and they use ground cover, weed barrier type stuff. If you have, it doesn't have to be a big zone, but if you have a zone where you can avoid using weed barrier, that would be best, because otherwise they can't burrow in successfully and get to have access to some of that dirt they need for their nesting sites.
Great. So there's really a lot we can do to make our yard both appealing to pollinators and ourselves. It sounds like,
Absolutely.
If you want your favorite plants and, like you said, some of that ground cover, you can have that section, but save a section for the bees.
Absolutely.
So I love that. Is there any other tips or tricks you want to share with us today, Jenny?
I'm happy to answer any other questions if anybody ever wants more information about specific plants or whatnot that they can use to help attract pollinators to the yard. I'm happy to answer those. Rocks are another really good landscape feature that create niches for bees that they can utilize for overwintering and for laying larvae. Down logs are great. I think overall just, keep pollinators in mind, because the more pollinators you have in your garden, the more successful they're going to be. So the more successful your garden's going to be.
Absolutely. And pollinators are responsible for, I think, about 1 in 3 bites of food we take.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
The more we can do for them, the better.
Great.
Thank you for allowing us into your yard today, Jenny, and sharing with us your garden and some gardening tips.
You bet. Anytime.